I'm Andreas Enfeldt from dietdoctor.com, and I'm here with perhaps the world's foremost expert on paleo diets. Could that be true?
Well, that's awful flattering, Andreas, but I've been involved from the very beginning with this. I think there's a number of key people, and I think that I'm probably in that core of key people that have promoted this concept and continue to promote it.
Yeah, so your name is Loren Cordain, and you're a professor and researcher in Paleolithic diets, among other things.
Pretty much. My research in the last 20 years is focused on diet and this evolutionary basis for human diet.
Yeah. So I was going to start asking you, what is a Paleolithic diet and why is it so popular today?
Well, Paleolithic stands for the Old Stone Age, and the Old Stone Age began with the invention of stone tools, and that happened about 2.5 million years ago, and it lasted up until the beginnings of the agricultural revolution, which was 10,000 years ago. And during that period, all humans were hunter-gatherers, and the food that they consumed was the food that they could forage, hunt, gather, or fish, and it was basically fresh food. Obviously, there was no processed foods or any foods that came about with the Neolithic and the Industrial Revolution. So what we try to do with the contemporary paleo diet is to try to mimic the food groups that our ancestral hunter-gatherers consumed, and with modern foods that are available at the supermarket. The only real caveat to that is, the only exception is that I think it's better if people can get grass-produced meats, beef, free-ranging chicken, and so forth. So those are superior to meat that has been produced in a grain or grain produced in a feedlot. So that's pretty much the basis of the diet. And if you look at the food groups that our Stone Age ancestors didn't consume, they didn't eat cereal grains except as starvation foods occasionally. They certainly weren't staples. They didn't consume dairy products because they hadn't domesticated cows. And all of the processed foods that we eat now come from 4 major food groups: cereal grains, dairy products, vegetable oils, and refined sugars, and salt. And if you put those all together, you can call it a donut, a cookie, a pizza. You can call it anything you want, but it's basically the same 4 ingredients that are used in all sorts of processed foods. And most Americans and Europeans consume roughly 70% of their calories as those 4 food types. And so what we try to do is eliminate or severely reduce those foods and focus on real living foods like fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, nuts and seeds, and, as I mentioned, grass-produced meats. Seafood and fish are really the foundation of this diet.
So I find it fascinating. You write in your book, The Paleo Answer. I mean, this is all based on evolution, right? And which is probably the most powerful idea in biology. And some people have said that nothing in biology makes any sense except in the light of evolution. But even so, that's not what we base our nutritional guidelines on today. Official guidelines don't really care about evolution at all.
Well, I think you're right. I think that nutrition is a very young discipline in that it doesn't have an organizational template. Like if you look at cosmology, cosmology is how the universe formed, and we know that the orienting paradigm is the Big Bang Theory. And so in nutrition is applied biology. And so the most fundamental of all ideas in all of biology, and indeed nothing in biology makes sense except under the light of evolution. So that statement should be extended to nutrition, is that nothing in nutrition makes sense except under the light of evolution. Unfortunately, the nutritional community is either unaware of this or they haven't bought into it yet. But evolution through natural selection won't go away. It is the most powerful idea humans have ever created to help us understand biology. And so eventually it will become the de facto guiding template for nutrition. I'm 61 years old and I should live so long to see that occur. But I would predict that in 20, 30 years or so, the USDA guidelines will no longer be based on fallible human ideas, which we call the My Plate or the food pyramid. It'll be based on these kinds of ideas. And so the evolutionary basis for nutrition really didn't get going until 1985 with Boyd Eaton's famous paper in New England Journal. So what are we, 35 years down the road? And in another 35 years, hopefully it'll be fully integrated into nutrition. So we'll at least have the information. And I predict that this concept will be refined. It certainly should be refined as more randomized controlled trials are done and as we understand our biologies and our metabolism in a better manner. But the basic concept will never leave us, is that our genome was shaped by this ancestral environment, this Stone Age environment. And we are literally Stone Agers living in the Space Age. Now we have, some genetic adaptations that have occurred since the agricultural revolution, but genomic sweeps of populations from around the planet suggest that in the past 60,000 years, we're pretty much like we were 60,000 years ago, just as we left Africa. There's certain parts of our immune system that have changed fairly dramatically. Adult lactase persistence and some hemoglobinopathies come to mind, but for the most part, our basic biology is no different than humans that were living 60,000 years ago.
Right, and like you said, we're Stone Agers living in the Space Age. What kind of health implications does that have?
Well, if you look at the health issues that impact Westernized people, Europeans, Americans, people from all over the planet that now have embraced this Western culture of processed foods and supermarkets and so forth and have abandoned their traditional foods and activity patterns, we see very characteristic diseases, not the least of which is the metabolic syndrome. So obesity, the metabolic syndrome, and diseases of civilization, for instance, acne. Acne runs rampant in Europe. Virtually all teenagers ultimately get it, same way in America. We know that acne doesn't exist in traditional cultures consuming non-processed type foods that don't eat sugar and refined flours and vegetable oils and what have you.
So that's fascinating. That could mean that if we lived like our ancestors, there would be no acne.
Well, I think so. I think that we now have, I'm a scientist at a Division I research institution, so part of my job is to write scientific papers, to write grants, and to review scientific papers for other scientific journals. And so I'm privy to much of the dermatology literature that has to do with diet and acne, because the article that I wrote in the Archives of Dermatology in 2002 really opened up the diet acne debate after 30 years of being shut down. And so I just reviewed a paper from a South Korean group showing that high protein, low carb, low glycemic load diets improves acne symptoms. And they measured a number of end markers of inflammation and this and that and whatever that are used to kind of identify some of the inflammatory markers that we see with skin diseases like acne. And so they all improved. So we now have, I believe, 3 or 4 randomized controlled trials. And this information, once again, will not go away, is that because of the internet now, everybody can talk to everybody. So you can go online and have access to me instantaneously across the planet, and I to you. So secrets are no longer kept through scientific journals, is that the information flows very, very rapidly because of the internet. And I think that this whole idea of diet and acne is burgeoning. And again, I'm at the end of my career, but young people, young dermatologists who don't know the dogma of previous years that diet, quote unquote, had nothing to do with acne will now see the good science. They'll see the mechanisms behind it. And the upshot of it is that we will now have alternative treatments for teenagers and even young adults who have acne that aren't necessarily pharmaceutically based.
Right. I mean, acne is a big problem, obviously, for a lot of people, but paleo diets could help with a lot of other diseases that might be even bigger problems in society today, such as?
That's right, Andreas. And the skin is just one organ, and the skin is an external manifestation. So we see what's going on with the organ by looking at it on the outside. So it's very obvious that there's a disease. But disease most frequently doesn't manifest itself externally. Disease manifests itself internally. And so the diseases that are prevalent throughout the Western world, hypertension in the United States, if you reach your sixth decade, 75% of all Americans in their sixth decade are hypertensive. We don't see an age-related increase in blood pressure in groups, particularly a group of Indians called the Yanomamo from Brazil. And they're a society that doesn't eat salt, they don't eat processed foods, and they eat a lot of fresh fruit. And so they have a very high potassium intake, very low sodium intake. Blood pressure stays normal throughout their lives. And what we consider normal, 120 over 80, systolic over diastolic pressure, would be considered elevated in their society. So their normal blood pressure is roughly 100 over 70. And that's probably the real norm for humans, is that 120 over 80, even though we consider that normal in the Western world, probably isn't, because of, we know that high glycemic load carbohydrates and salt both tend to work in tandem to elevate blood pressure.
So in your opinion, who would benefit the most from a paleo diet today?
Well, if we look at the healthcare costs in the United States, we spend more money on healthcare than we spend on the war in Iraq and Iran and everything else. And I don't know how it works in European countries, but certainly the government has to subsidize healthcare costs in one form or another. And we're not spending billions, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on these endemic diseases that run rampant in the Western world. I mentioned the metabolic syndrome, so dyslipidemia, high blood cholesterol, high triglycerides, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, obesity. We also believe that the epithelial cell cancers, breast, colon, and prostate, are diet related. And work that we have done examining the historical literature suggests, and again, the literature is spotty, because to go back in time, you don't get good epidemiology studies like what we have now. We can go into populations and really nail it. We can get hundreds of thousands of people with well-defined measurements. But to go back to 1890 and to try to extract that information out of populations is difficult. But the available evidence before hunter-gatherers became westernized suggests that epithelial cell cancers basically didn't exist in those populations.
Epithelial cell cancers meaning?
Epithelial cells are cells that line the inside or the outside of organs. So like with breast cancer, where the cancer occurs is in the milk duct. And what lines the milk duct are epithelial cells, and those are the cells that become cancerous. In males, prostate cancer, there are cells that line the duct that comes from out of the prostate gland. And so those epithelial cells are the cells that develop cancer. Same way with colon cancer, epithelial cells line the colon. And one of the reasons why we think that these cancers are so prevalent is these cells, epithelial cells, are very rapidly turning over cells. So they are constantly sloughing off and turning over, and they have a very short half-life. And there are certain hormones that influence epithelial cells, and one of them is called IGF-1, and another one's called IGF binding protein 3. And so if you eat the typical Western diet, it tends to elevate IGF-1 and suppress IGF binding protein 3. And the balance of those two hormones seems to have adverse effects for people with epithelial cell cancers. So large epidemiologic studies suggest that high glycemic load carbohydrates are a risk for those cancers. Now, there's certainly probably other elements involved. We know that omega-3 and omega-6 fats also influence cancer cell growth. And so the typical Western diet has excessive linoleic acid from vegetable oil, and that's an omega-6 fatty acid. And we don't get very much long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. These are the healthful fatty acids that are found in fatty fish like salmon and mackerel and sardines and so forth. So multiple elements in the Western diet work synergistically to promote cancer. Also, high salt diet tends to promote cancer in rat models. So if you can take a rat model of a variety of different cancers, and you can put a group on a very high salt diet, and then you can take another group and put them on a low salt, high potassium diet. And what we find is that the low salt, high potassium has a lower incidence of cancers. So multiple elements work together. It's kind of like a symphony orchestra playing, is that we unconsciously eat these processed foods and don't even realize what we're doing.
Right. So I've read your book, your new book, The Paleo Answer. You wrote another book called Paleo Diet. Was it 8 years ago or something?
That book I started writing it in 2000, and it hit the bookstores in December of 2001, January 2002. So it's been out roughly
a decade.
A decade, yeah.
But now you've updated it a little bit, perhaps. And I have a few questions from after reading this book that I find really interesting. The first one is, there's been a lot of debate recently on the internet and in other places if paleo diets were low carb necessarily, or if paleo has nothing to do with low carb. What's your opinion?
Well, we've actually done the analysis. So we've looked at there are 229 hunter-gatherer societies that have been studied historically and reported in the scientific literature. And so we've compiled that data. We've also compiled data in the 13 quantitative studies. And what we found is that if we look at the plant-to-animal subsistence ratio, we find that whenever and wherever it was possible, hunter-gatherers always preferred animal food to plant food. And so they clearly preferred fatty animals to animals that were lean. So, and they did what was called selective butchering, where they actually ate the fattest part of the carcass. So they ate the marrow, they ate the brains, they ate the fat around the kidneys. They actually even ate the fat behind the eyes, the retroorbital fat, the mesenteric fat. They ate everything that was fat, and sometimes they abandoned part of the carcass if they had sufficient other food. So the bottom line is that paleo diets, if I had to characterize it, would have always been lower in carbohydrates than the typical Western diet. And our calculations show the typical Western diet, we're looking at about a little over 50% of the calories from carbohydrate. I think it's 52 or something. And paleo diets, there was a range that we've calculated, roughly 20, and at the outside high, maybe 35 to 40%. But they got all of their carbohydrates from fruits and vegetables. And if you were to go to the supermarket right now and I say, Andreas, the only carbohydrate you can get is in that outside aisle of fruits and vegetables, unless you chose yams and sweet potatoes, you have great difficulty in getting your carbs much beyond 25% of total calories, simply because the volume of food that's required to get more than 25% of calories is very, very difficult when you eat foods like celery and tomatoes and apples and oranges and so forth. You have to eat a ton of these foods, and your stomach volume is limited. So it's difficult to achieve that kind of a caloric intake on fruits and vegetables.
So if you stick to true Paleolithic food groups, you would basically have to eat some sort of low-carb diet.
Pretty much. I know of some endurance athletes who are probably eating a moderate carb diet, but it's a low glycemic load diet because they obtain their carbohydrates from low glycemic index carbohydrates like yams and sweet potatoes. And if you you can theoretically, like if you start juicing fruits and vegetables and carrots and so forth, then using modern mechanical means, you can certainly get it up to high unphysiologic non-hunter-gatherer types. But I don't recommend that, particularly for people that are obese or have a metabolic syndrome symptom is that they should be very careful with fruit and fruit juices. If you're an endurance athlete, you need to replenish glycogen stores in your muscles. So that's a little bit different story, and we've kind of addressed that in my second book, The Paleo Diet for Athletes. So those folks are much more insulin sensitive than people with the metabolic syndrome or obesity, and it doesn't seem to have nearly the problem. When they stop training, then it can become problematic.
So that's also an interesting subject. I think the connection between carbohydrates in the diet, hyperinsulinemia, and metabolic syndrome, obesity, those kind of disorders. What's your take on that?
Well, it's very difficult to produce obesity or insulin resistance or the metabolic syndrome unless you consume processed foods. So you got to eat sugar, you got to eat refined flour, and if you mix that up with vegetable oil and salt, you can call it a cookie or a cake or whatever you want to call it, a donut or, you know, candy, fudge, you name it. So we've invented all of these processed foods, but the problem is that we are artificially putting two components, two macronutrients together that are not found in real foods. So we're taking sugar or sweet, we're combining it with fat. And so that combination of sugar and sweet and fat doesn't occur in any natural food. I defy anybody that listens to this broadcast or this production to tell me a single food that is both high in fat and high in carbohydrate. Nuts aren't. Okay? Nuts are very low in carbohydrate, they're high in fat. Avocados, same thing. They're high in fat, but they're low in carbohydrate. So there's no naturally occurring food that has that combination. And that combination is absolutely deadly. And so we heard from Jeff Volek yesterday's talk, and he is one of the experts. And he said that, you know, saturated fat by itself probably is not problematic because we can oxidize it and it doesn't produce atherosclerosis. But saturated fat combined with a high carbohydrate diet is deadly. And that's why we have this epidemic of cardiovascular disease in the Western world, is because that's how we take our saturated fat. We take it along with a high carbohydrate diet.
But that's also a subject you devote a chapter to, the question about saturated fats in the diet, and you write that you sort of changed your view a little bit. I mean, most people have, I guess, in the last decade or last
well, there's
few
been
years.
there's been so much new information that has come out in the mechanisms that underlie atherosclerosis. So I think that, you know, you can't throw out some of the early pioneers, the people that identified the LDL receptor. That's still good science. We know that saturated fats downregulate the LDL receptor, but that's a tiny part of the atherosclerotic process. And so in the decade since I wrote the book, and remember, the science that I was looking at when I first wrote that book was 30 years ago, okay? So that was the best science, and we've come a long ways, and so we understand this much, much better. My first book, The Paleo Diet, I wrote in 2002. I revised it in 2010, and it reflects the new information about saturated fat. I've reversed my position on this. It's been almost 7 or 8 years, and I'm still being kind of brought to the front. It's like, oh, he's the guy that doesn't support saturated fat. That's completely untrue. I wrote a paper, a scientific book chapter, in the year 2005, so that's 7 years ago, and I said that it's outrageously, and what we did is we analyzed the diets of hunter-gatherers for specifically saturated fats. There's absolutely no way in the world you can get below 10% of your calories from saturated fat, yet those are the guidelines. In fact, most of the hunter-gatherer societies, the majority, were consuming higher than 15%. So the recommendations to reduce saturated fat, to reduce cardiovascular disease, only hold true is if you're eating a high-carb diet. But a high-carb diet all by itself is also problematic. So a high-carb, low-fat diet still is atherogenic. So to my way of thinking is that the government recommendations are flawed and they're not based upon the best science. And so in the last 2 years, we've got 3 powerful meta-analyses that have combined all of the epidemiologic studies and all of the randomized controlled trials. And the conclusion of the largest studies that have ever been done on saturated fat would suggest that it has a very minimal effect on the development of cardiovascular disease. But if you've got somebody back in Sweden who's eating donuts and consuming bacon and eggs for breakfast, he's in a world of hurt. So he says, Cordain says saturated fat's okay, and he continues to eat the donuts.
Which one should they quit first?
Well, you know the answer to that. Of course, they ought to get rid of the donuts, the high glycemic load.
Of course. But I find it interesting. Official guidelines say you should reduce the saturated fat to 10% or maybe even below 7%. And you say 15% is perhaps normal for hunter-gatherers.
we did the analysis, and it depends on, you know, there wasn't a single hunter-gatherer diet. They ate a variety of foods, and their plant-to-animal subsistence ratio changed throughout the year. Sometimes they ate a lot of plant foods, sometimes they ate a lot of animal foods, but they never would have ever consumed less than 10% of their calories as saturated fats, only under perhaps starvation conditions when they couldn't get any animal foods. But for the most part, the human genome was conditioned by high saturated fat intake. And if your readers want to find that out, they can go to my website, thepaleodiet.com, and they can download that book chapter on the saturated fats and get all the details.
So if you believe in the theory of evolution and you try to eat a paleo-ish diet, you should probably not be afraid of saturated fat then.
I think under the context of the paleo diet, saturated fat really has a minimal effect on either cancer or heart disease.
Okay, so I have another subject that I find really interesting. You write quite a long chapter on vegetarianism, vegetarians, vegans, and the health impact of eating a vegetarian diet. You say vegetarian diets are clearly a nightmare, you write in your book. Why?
Well, you know, people should read the chapter. It's a difficult concept to explain in 5 minutes or less because there's so many problems with a vegetarian lifestyle and a vegetarian diet. The first thing that I point out is that if you look at the evolutionary record, if you look at hunter-gatherers, there's no vegan or vegetarian hunter-gatherers. And the reason for it is because natural selection would have weeded out that behavior, because the behavior of eating only plant foods and not eating animal foods is lethal. Okay? It'll eventually kill you. And it produces disease. And so reproduction into adulthood then is going to be impaired. So people that don't eat meat won't reproduce. So that, if it's a genetic thing that's causing the behavior, that'll be a problem. So that's why hunter-gatherers don't do it, because it's a lethal behavioral adaptation. Now, the second major factor is perhaps 50 to 60% of people who become vegans or vegetarians do so because they think they're improving their health. All right, so they think that they'll escape cancer and heart disease and type 2 diabetes and everything else that kills us in the Western world. Well, until 1999, no scientists ever got around to looking at mortality in vegetarians/vegans. And so a fellow from England by the name of Dr. Key finally got around to doing that, and he published his results in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. He examined, I think it was like 28,000 vegan vegetarians, and overall mortality didn't differ from all causes combined from the average hamburger eater in society. So they didn't escape heart disease, they didn't escape cancer, and same thing. So this study was replicated again in 2009. These are called meta-analyses. And what scientists do is anybody can cherry pick a study. If you're a vegetarian, you can cherry pick a single study and say, look, this supports my cause. Or if I'm non-vegetarian, I can cherry pick another study and say, look, this supports my cause. So we've kind of gotten over that. And in the last decade, what we do now is we employ what are called meta-analyses. And we can use statistical procedures to bring together all the studies that have ever been done on the topic. And that's what we've done with vegan vegetarians. As I mentioned, the most comprehensive one was published in 2009 by Key's group once again, and it was even a larger sample. I think it's close to 40,000. And there was a slight evidence that they may have, a certain group may have done just a little bit better with cardiovascular disease, but the whole group, compared to the whole of society, didn't. And so, so if you adopt a vegetarian or vegan diet to become healthier, it's not going to happen. And part of the reason is because there's so many nutrient deficiencies you're going to develop if you stop eating animal
such
food.
as?
Well, first thing you're going to develop, and this happens almost overnight, is zinc. Okay? Now, if you measure zinc in plasma, so if you draw blood and you measure it in plasma, you can't get a very good handle on it because zinc doesn't bind in plasma proteins very well. Where zinc occurs is intracellularly. And so the way you have to measure zinc is you have to scrape cells from your mouth, the inside of your mouth. You can scrape them open and then break open those cells, and then you can measure zinc. And so the studies that have actually measured intracellular zinc, you put people on a vegan diet where they don't eat any animal products, within 7 or 8 days, they start to become zinc deficient. So,
and then what happens? What happens when you're zinc deficient?
Well, zinc is involved in all kinds of intracellular mechanisms involving immunity. People that become, if you get an upper respiratory sickness, what does the physician tell you to do? Take some zinc lozenges, you know, rub zinc in your nostrils or whatever. So zinc is involved in many immunological functions. It's also involved in healing. So type 2 diabetics develop sores in their lower extremities that don't heal very well at all. So there's all kinds of strategies to try to get these things to heal because circulation is so poor. But one of the strategies that is used is to rub zinc oxide on their wounds because zinc oxide directly stimulates the healing process. Zinc is involved in anti-inflammatory mechanisms as well. So inflammation drives cardiovascular disease, cancer, and autoimmunity. And so if you have a impaired or a compromised zinc status, you're promoting chronic low-level inflammation. So zinc happens right off the bat. Iron, it takes a little bit longer. There's a storage form of iron called ferritin, and the only way to accurately measure blood stores of iron, or the body stores of iron, is to measure ferritin. And there's only a single study that has examined ferritin after you put people on a vegan vegetarian type diet. And part of the problem is the study was done in women, and women lose blood through their menstrual cycle on a monthly basis. So unless you compensate for that, you can't interpret the results. So all other studies in men that have gone on short-term studies show that serum ferritin levels start to plummet after a couple weeks. So iron is involved in all sorts of mechanisms that involve cognition, health, well-being. In the third world, where, not around third world, but non-industrialized countries where people don't have access, don't have a lot of money to be able to purchase animal products, iron deficiency is a huge, huge problem. And in young developing children, it adversely impacts cognitive development, so it lowers the IQ. And so people that think they're doing their children a favor by putting them on a vegan vegetarian diet are actually probably doing them one of life's biggest disservices by not giving them the opportunity to have mental development during these critical years. So zinc and iron, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. If you eat a plant-based diet, there's no long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in any plant food. So unless you supplement, you're going to immediately become deficient in long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And unless somebody has been living in a telephone booth or someplace that you can't see what's going on in the Western world, virtually all kinds of chronic diseases improve with long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. The list goes on. Iodine deficiency is very common in vegan vegetarians. there's an amino acid called taurine that's only found in animal products, and vegan vegetarians become deficient in taurine, and we know that taurine influences a process called platelet aggregation, which is a clotting process that goes along with cardiovascular disease, so it makes things worse. And, you know, I'm getting old and tired, so I can't think of the entire laundry list, so you read my book.
That's a lot of nutrients anyway. So vegetarians and vegans...
B6. Vitamin B6 is another one.
In your view, they basically all get nutritional deficiencies?
Yeah. If you decide to do that and you don't supplement or you don't eat... Oh, and the biggest one, of course, is vitamin B12.
Yeah,
that's huge.
Most common.
Yeah, so B12 is responsible for getting rid of a toxic intermediary compound in our bloodstreams called homocysteine. We used to think that homocysteine just irritated the cells lining the arteries, the endothelial cells. And so we now know that homocysteine adversely affects all cells, bones, reproductive cells, testes, ovary, everything. When homocysteine is high, adversely affects it. So the best way to elevate homocysteine is to go on a vegan vegetarian diet.
And that's bad. Okay, you even say that eating vegetarian food is a very unnatural way of eating, and you call it abnormal. So I have to ask, what do vegans say to you? What do they think of your arguments?
Eating is a highly charged, politically, behaviorally induced behavior that we all have to do pretty much on a daily basis. So there's more to eating than just the science of what it does to our health and well-being. So many vegans consume vegetarian diets because they think it's going to make them healthier. Well, just read my chapter 4 and the 200 or so references that I provided, and you can see that it doesn't. But some people do it for religious reasons and, for ecologic and environmental reasons, and that's their choice. I'm not trying to preach or force my viewpoint on people that do it for that, but what I would say is that the data simply doesn't support doing it for health reasons.
Right. So, moving on from vegetarians. So next question, dairy products. Why are they bad for us, in your view?
Oh, God.
Just the short version.
The short version. Well, I guess the biggest reason is that 65% of the people on the planet don't have the enzyme to break down the sugar in milk. So the sugar is called lactose, and we have an enzyme called lactase. And in most people on the planet, after weaning, lactase loses its activity and they can't drink milk. So that ought to tell us something, is that when 65% of the people on the planet can't drink milk without gastric upset, we've got a problem. No other mammal on the planet consumes the milk of another species at any time in their lifespan. And milk is not just this white substance that's high in calcium. Milk is a potent endocrine stimulator that is evolved through millions of years of mammalian evolution to have a therapeutic and growth-inducing effect on the young of a mammal. And so that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to make the animal grow very, very rapidly, give it immunity, and give it a boost in life to get started. And so what we're doing is we're taking, and milk is just an absolute chock full of hormones and bioactive peptides. So these things do get past the gut barrier and they cause adverse health effects. So we know that type 1 diabetes in children, that milk is a suspect factor because they develop antibodies to bovine insulin. So there's insulin in cow's milk, and it survives pasteurization, and it survives the marketing and the whole process. So the fact that we have antigens being formed, antibodies being formed against bovine insulin means that bovine insulin is interacting with our immune system. So it's getting past the gut barrier, and T cells and B cells, these are parts of the immune system, are eliciting a reaction to this foreign antigen. And epidemiologic studies suggest it's not just type 1 diabetes, that other autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis, are associated with milk consumption. Recently, there's a paper that came from a group in Scandinavia, from your part of the world, Christian Hoppy's group, and what they did is they fed 8-year-old boys, they got 24 8-year-old boys, and they fed them protein either as milk, so all their protein came as milk or as meat. And they did it for a 7-week period, and then they crossed them over. And during the period in which they were consuming milk, they all became insulin resistant. And so insulin resistant is the preliminary step behind the development of obesity and the metabolic syndrome. So that study needs to be replicated in a well-controlled group of adults. It hasn't been done yet, but when that study is done, that will have implications that will resonate throughout the world.
Yeah, I guess. So there's plenty of reasons to believe that maybe dairy products are better to be avoided, but a lot of people like them. So I would like to ask, do you have any tips? What kind of dairy products are the worst, and what might be, less bad?
Well, the adverse effects seem to come from milk proteins, particularly the whey fraction in milk. Lactose is probably not a very good sugar to eat either, because after we hydrolyze it, after we break it down in our gut, we produce glucose and galactose, and humans don't normally eat galactose. And galactose, we know we can induce senile cataracts in animal models very rapidly by feeding them a high lactose or galactose diet. So there's, we don't have experimental evidence in humans, and we probably will never do those experiments because it takes so long to develop senile cataracts. But I suspect that a high milk diet throughout life tends to predispose people for senile cataracts. It's also, the epidemiologic studies also implicate it in prostate cancer in men and breast and ovarian cancer in women. So it's a nasty substance. It's designed to cause growth in calves, and it causes growth in humans. It stimulates growth. We know that if you drink milk, it elevates a hormone called IGF-1, and elevations in IGF-1, we've been through this before, they're caused by high glycemic load carbohydrates. They're also caused by milk. So pouring yourself a bowl of Kellogg's Corn Flakes with milk in the morning and consuming that with some fruit juice is perhaps one of the absolute worst breakfasts you could ever do.
And a very common one.
And a very common one, because it's easy to put together, it's quick, and it tastes good, I guess.
So moving on to the other product that I enjoy, butter. That's fairly low in lactose, fairly low in milk protein.
Yeah,
would that be more?
I would say that
dangerous?
I would say that the only dairy product that I would advocate, and obviously it's not paleo, but it contains none of the proteins, very, very few of the whey proteins, and the fatty acid profile, we used to worry about it because it contains so much palmitic acid, but we've been through that story before, is that saturated fats are probably not problematic in the face of low carbohydrate diets.
So butter would be almost okay?
Not almost, it would be okay.
Wow, a lot of people are happy now watching.
Well, and I think Jeff Volek also made the statement is that high-fat foods help with satiety, okay? So when you go on a low-carb or a high-carb, low-fat diet, people are hungry all the time because they're not eating protein and they're not eating fat. And protein and fat are more satiating than carbohydrates, particularly high glycemic load carbs.
So moving on, we only have a few more minutes, but I would like to talk briefly about a big subject called leaky gut.
Yeah.
Could you just summarize what that's about?
A decade ago, I wrote a paper we published in the British Journal of Nutrition in which we implicated leaky gut in autoimmunity, and that was a decade before its time. And for scientists at a Division I research institution to make that statement, it was almost blasphemy. So I really had to go out on the limb, because at the time it just seemed like quote unquote junk science. If you go on Medline now, there are tens of thousands of papers dealing with leaky gut, and it's become a real issue. And we know that chronic low-level inflammation drives heart disease, cancer, and autoimmunity. And so the $64,000 question is, where does chronic low-level inflammation come from? If you're a physician and somebody comes to you and they've got pyorrhea or gum disease, well, you better be very worried not just about their gum, but their heart. And so we know that gum disease is a risk factor for heart disease. Why is that? Is because it produces chronic systemic low-level inflammation. But we have a much larger interface besides our mouth, and that's our gut. We have about 2 square football fields or soccer fields. That's how much area we have in our gut that's exposed to the outside world, because even though our gut runs in the middle of our body, it's in theory outside our body. And so there's a huge floral load of bacteria and viruses and pathogens, and also commensal bacteria that are found in the gut. So there's good and bad bacteria. And when we end up with a leaky gut, the bad bacteria, these are gram-negative bacteria, they contain a substance in their cell wall called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. And lipopolysaccharide immediately causes the immune system to become inflamed. It's like there's no other response. It's like turning on a light switch. There's no if, then, or. Most biological systems, we have multiple negative feedback mechanisms that say, well, I'm going to get fired up here, I'm not. When LPS gets into our body, boom, it's like pouring gasoline on fire. And so LPS is very much pro-inflammatory. And we have cells lining our gut called dendritic cells, and so and macrophages. These are the first lines of defense. And so they bind this LPS, and they have a specific receptor called a toll-like receptor 4. And so when LPS binds toll-like receptor 4, it upregulates or it increases the synthesis of pro-inflammatory cytokines, TNF-alpha, IL-6, and so forth. And this, if you have a leaky gut chronically over your entire lifetime, then you've got this chronic low-level inflammation, systemic inflammation going on. And the typical Western diet produces a leaky gut through a variety of mechanisms. High glycemic load carbohydrates seem to cause leaky gut, so sugar and white flour. Wheat causes a leaky gut in many people. Beans, potatoes, even green tomatoes have a substance that induces leaky gut. A fully ripe red tomato probably is okay, but green tomatoes contain a substance called alpha-tomatine that promote leaky gut. Alcohol causes a leaky gut. Birth control pills cause leaky gut. If you take antacids, they contain a substance called aluminum hydroxide, or alum. That increases leaky gut. If you like hot, spicy foods, they cause a leaky gut, but they contain substances called capsaicin. So chili peppers also cause a leaky gut. Gut heals very, very rapidly. So if you have a leaky gut in the beginning of the morning, probably by afternoon, if you don't continue eating these foods, it can heal itself up. So if you get these foods out of the diet, like with the paleo diet, you're in good shape.
Yeah, I find this a fascinating subject, and you link this leaky gut to all kinds of autoimmune disease.
We think so. We think that, and not just us, Alessio Fasano's group, although my paper was the seminal paper in the scientific literature dating back to 2002, Fasano's group, who are the premier celiac people in the world, they've also, I think by about 2005, they came up with a very eloquent mechanism whereby wheat causes leaky gut. So,
but yeah, it's a fascinating theory. But you write still you write in your book that there's no scientific studies to date performed regarding the paleo diet and leaky gut.
That's right. We need to do those studies, and you know, as I mentioned, the very first paleo diet paper with Boyd Eaton's in 1985. So here we are, you know, 15, 25, 30 years later, and it's now being taken seriously. I'm involved as a consultant in a group that is testing paleo diet in an NIH R01 grant, a large group of people over a 2-year period. So hopefully this kind of information will start coming out.
Yeah, so a lot more research to be done, but if someone wants to start today, what's the most important thing, would you say, if you want to move from a Western diet to something more healthy, paleo-like? What's the most important 1, 2, 3 things?
Well, you know, in the United States, the way supermarkets are set up is that the real food is in the outside aisles. And they do that deliberately so that you have to walk through the inner aisles where all the processed foods is to get to the real food. So I would say your first step is to make your food choices primarily in the outer aisles and stay away from the inside aisles.
That's the number one thing.
That would be a very easy starting point. So get yourself fruit and vegetables and meat and fish, and you're in good shape. And stay away from the bread aisle and the canned foods and that kind of stuff.
Excellent. So if we want to learn more about this, what should
I would say go to my website if you want to get a lot of information for free, the paleodiet.com, and all my scientific papers can be downloaded for free. You can get discounts on my books. You can become, the website is going to be updated here shortly. You can become a member, and I'll be doing regular podcasts and all kinds of fancy stuff. So
good, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I appreciate it.